So let me briefly explain why I choose those two cases. I choose failure rather than the success cases because success cases are all the same, you see, because they are low-hanging fruits. It's a good expression I learned in these companies. And on the case of Japan, the regulatory reform worked so well concerning manufacturing sector because manufacturing sectors are facing international competition. So whether they are RIA or not, they have to deregulate in order to compete with Americans, Chinese, and others. But concerning for the agriculture and service sector, they don't have much competition, and there are a lot of low-hanging fruits concerning those sectors. And also those issues are so-called social regulation. In Japan, the distinction between economic versus social regulation is so important. They agree that the economic regulation have to be removed, but not social regulation. It has to be done more cautiously. And particularly in these labor market issues and taxi issues is a part of the transportation. They relate to not only the efficiency of the economy, but for the safety of the passengers, for example. And so there are a lot of misleading discussion on that. And having said that, let me discuss on the agency worker issues. Agency worker is a special form of working where worker is employed in a company A and actually work for the company B. And so it's a kind of indirect employment rather than direct employment. And actually that type of work had been severely restricted even in the world, ILO or International Labour Organization. But because of the persistent high unemployment rate in Europe, they changed their mind and they moved to the wider deregulation in late 1990s. And Japan followed that trend, and there is a strong deregulation concerning these agency workers. But and actually that was largely succeeded, but because of the increasing ratio of the so-called agency workers, which are part of the non-regular workers, in Japan there is a confrontation of the interest between regular workers whose jobs are secured by the employer and non-regular workers who works like a shock absorber in the case of recession in order to protect the security of the regular workers. And actually there is an opposing party took the regime in early in 2009, and they are supported by labor union, and they try to tighten the regulation on agency workers because they are competing with regular workers. And so that is the case for the Japan's regulatory reform. It worked so well before, but now there's the repercussions. And actually it's like a counterback of the regulation took place. And but after 2011, when Prime Minister Abe took back the regime, and the new regulatory reform on agency worker for liberalization is now under discussion in the diet. And so it's a very hot issue, and that's why I choose this topic. And actually it's very clear that in the first stage we had a very significant deregulation for agency workers. That's why their number increased substantially. But because of the Lehman shock, those number of the agency workers dropped. It's not only Japan, but it's happening all over the world. But after the Lehman shock, because of the deregulation, their number hasn't increased very much compared with the total non-regular workers. So actually, this is the effect of regulations. And what are the role of the RMS? Actually, the big policy is for the market-based economy that existed in the beginning of early 2000 under the Koizumi government. And actually, the regulatory reform committee, in which I was one of the members, took an initiative for the market-based regulation. And that kind of regulatory reform worked well, being supported by the strong political leaders. But after the Lehman shock, because there was an increasing number of the unemployed, there is an alternative big policy for reducing the income disparity. According to them, increasing number of the agency workers or non-regular workers increase the income disparity of Japan that should be prevented. And the Democratic Party took the regime, took that kind of policies. And so the point is, in Japan we don't have RIA. Well, that's a bit confusing because officially we have a very good RIA, and in every new laws or revision of the laws, regulators are forced to review the effect of such kind of regulation. And if you ask the Japanese government official whether you have a RIA, they say yes, we have completely done the RIA, but it's only for the official use. In the actual, in reality, they do it only for the formalities. And they're not, RIA is not done effectively because it's done mainly by the regulators and nobody checks the result. And so that is our real problems. But this lack of RIA works both ways. When we make a regulatory reform, we don't make enough RIAs to show the effect. So when they counter back, they do it without the RIA process. And that is a key issue. And second issue is taxi liberalization law. And this is a law controlling the supply and fare of the taxis. And actually that was very significant regulation in Japan. But again, by the Koizumi government, they waived the constraint on the supply of taxi vehicles completely. And but the major problem with this regulation is it's a quite unbalanced regulatory reform, because as a political compromise, they kept the price control basically remained. So you can see the result. While the increasing number of the supply of the taxi vehicles, while the prices are fixed, and so it has not matched with the increasing demand, even though the supply increases. So there is a typical oversupply of taxi vehicles, and per capita income of the taxi drivers dropped substantially. And because of that, there's a political pressures, and actually the opposing parties, they re-regulate these taxis in order to recover the per capita income of taxi drivers. If taxi drivers become poor, that's very risky, because they try to, compensate the per capita income by make a quite rough speed, what we call kamikaze taxi. And so that's not safe for the passengers. That's their reasons. And but this was not very effective. And so the regulation was further tightened in 2013 by the Diet members. This deregulation was done by the Ministry of Transportation, but because it was not effective, so politicians comes into, and they made more strict regulations. And this is very clear that the number of taxi vehicles increased significantly with the deregulation at Koizumi government. But after that, the tightening of the regulations, taxi number declined substantially, even below the regulatory reform. Nevertheless, per capita income of the taxi drivers hasn't increased very much compared with the average male service sector wages. Why? Because there are no increase in demand because the price are fixed, and also the stagnation of the economy. People avoid using the taxis, and the point is regulatory policy principle for the market-based economy, and it worked well before, and the Regulatory Reform Committee took an initiative in 2002, but not after that. And because of the political power of the sector-specific political pressures, and the regulatory reform is going back and back. And actually, it's a lack of RRA on the effect of regulations on the demand for taxis while fixing the fares. If you make a very good RIA, regulatory impact analysis, it's well perceived, it's well expected that you have to lower the taxi fares in order to stimulate the demand, matching with increase of supply. But actually, it didn't work in that way. And it was a better regulatory reform. We do need the regulatory impact analysis in reality, not for formalities. And it's quite important what will be the consequences of the revision of the law or establishment of the new laws. And for example, in the case of agency workers, does the employment increase or decrease by the tightening of the agency worker law? And according to the labor union leaders, if we deregulate agency workers, they will become regular workers. That's a kind of optimistic views. And actually, they have a higher risk of being unemployed if regulation was tightened. But there are no empirical analysis on that. And in the case of taxi laws, does the revenue of a taxi company increase or decrease by liberalization of the regulations? It's up to the consequences, whether the regulatory reform for the prices are included in addition to the supply. And of course, it's quite difficult to make a rigid estimate. But in Japan, there is always a special zone initiatives as a social experiment. And currently I'm working for that. And we can use special zones for social experiment, where what happens if taxi fares are liberalized, whether that increase or not. But actually there's strong opposition from the politicians and the administrations to do that. Finally, why is RI meddling through? Because we have a quite diversified power of the ministers with independent regulatory authorities. And so lack of policy coordination between the ministries by the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister Abe is quite eager for the market-based reform, but each regulator doesn't follow his directions. And actually, the Regulatory Reform Committee is a single independent institutions, but it's an ad hoc institution, not a permanent, and it consists of the private sector economists and on a part-time basis. And actually, there are not well balanced of power between regulators and those who perform the regulatory reform. So a lack of independent organization like Competitive Productivity Commission in Australia like that, which is responsible for RIA, is a major task for Japan. And would like to learn from your experience on that. Thank you very much.